Welcome to Making Video Games with Python Lesson 2. In this video, we're going to explore another resource, the game library, that simplifies your interaction with pygame. One of the first objects we're going to explore from this game library is the game object, which will allow us to create the window in which our games will exist. So let's get to it. So before we dive into code, let's talk a little bit about what this new resource provides. So one of the things I noticed when I first started teaching students how to make video games with Python, with pygame directly, was that the syntax was very heavy. They had to write a lot of code just to make some simple things happen. And because of that, they weren't able to focus as much on the logic of the game because they were so focused on having to fix their syntax errors as they were coding. So that's why gamelib.py was developed. It takes all that underlining code from pygame and it splits it up into various classes. So the students directly interact with these classes instead of directly interact with the pygame code. Throughout the video series, you're going to learn how to interact with all these individual classes. So don't feel like you have to learn it all in this video. Before we dive into the gamelib.py, let's review a little bit of what a class is. So a class is a model, a template for how an object should behave. You can spot a class by the word class up front. And then it's going to be have some class name, whatever that class name is. And then you might have some functions along with some variables that will be available to you from this class. Again, don't feel overwhelmed if you're not familiar with classes or you have no interest in working with classes. Again, this is just so you can appreciate what's going on inside that gamelib.py. Now, I want to highlight this function that you'll see with all the classes. This particular function, the init function, will tell you what parameters you need to provide when creating an object of that class. And we're going to see that today. So let's get to it. So if you haven't done so already, you should create a folder for yourself in where you're going to store your game as well as any pictures and sounds. Inside this folder, you should have gamelib.py. As part of this video, there'll be a link as to where you can download. Again, this is not something that needs to be installed. It just has to be downloaded and then placed in the same folder as you're going to have your game. So I'm going to go ahead and open this up. And let's just talk a little bit about, what I just covered, which is this library by itself does not work. It uses the pygame library. And you can see here, immediately within the first two lines, we're importing various parts of the pygame library. We also do some, requisite code that needs to happen before the game even starts. And this is a little bit of what I'm talking about. Just some of the syntax that needs to be in place in order to make things happen. Again, students were getting lost with that. I'm going to scroll down to the game object, which will be the first object we need to create in any game. So here goes that init function. And what we can see here is that in order to create a game, we have to provide a width, a height, and a title. You may notice I skipped over self. Again, this is part of the whole syntax of how classes work. Again, I'm not making this into a full lesson on classes, but just realize if you dive into the game library, anytime you see the word self, kind of ignore it. Again, it's part of the mechanics of how Python handles classes. You may notice I also did not talk about this variable, time equals 0. That's because right now it currently has a value. So any variable in the parameters of this particular function that don't have values are parameters that need to be provided values when we first create it. All right, so let's go over to our first game and let's give it a try. So I'm going to go ahead and open up another window. Now I've chosen to use IDLE. Again, you're more than welcome to use any editor you want in order to code your Python file. This comes as default whenever you install Python. So I'm going to go File, New. And the first thing we're going to do is simply bring in all that code from this file into our program. So I'm going to use from gamelib import everything. That's what the asterisk represents. The other important thing here as our first step is to ensure that we save this file in the same location as where our game library exists. So notice by default, Python wants to save things in the same folder where it was installed. That's not where we need to save our programs. So I currently have this folder on my desktop inside a folder called games. So I'm going to put it here. Let's call this lesson 2. And there it is. Now, without doing anything else, I'm simply going to run the program. And a couple of things happen here. You'll see this message about pygame. What this means is that we have successfully installed Python and pygame, the correct version, and that our code that's bringing in this game library, if you recall, inside the game library, we import pygame, that is also working. So there's a lot to be said with just that one line. If this line works without any errors, then that means we are ready to go to start our game. So in any game that we create using the game library, the first thing we have to do is we have to create a variable. And I usually just like to call the variable game. That is a game object. Now, if you recall, let's see this up here, put this together. In order for us to create a game object, we have to provide the width, the height, and the title. So let's do that. 600. And we won't get to creative, we'll simply say game. Let's save it and let's run this as well. Ta-da! So that one line right there, game, providing the width and the height, and the title produced this window. Now, as another selling point as to why this game library is so useful, if we didn't have this, you would have needed to write this particular code, these 2 lines of code, as well as, let me go back. Oh, I skipped it already. These 2 lines of code. So essentially, you would have needed to write about 5 lines of code with what we accomplished in 1. So again, that's what I want you to have coming out of the game library. It's just a simplified experience of how to actually create games. All right, so let's go back to our presentation and let's review what we've done. So in this video, we covered an additional resource called Game Library that simplifies your interaction with Pygame by dividing the code, the Pygame code, into game objects. The first object we explored was actually the game object, which allowed us to specify the width, the height, and the title, and actually to create our window. So hopefully you're excited about creating video games and enjoy.